If you want to know what a city really thinks of you, try pushing a 300-pound metal food cart through its streets during a winter downpour. The city doesn't hate you. It just doesn't care if you exist. The rusted iron handle of the cart was freezing, biting right through the thin, worn cotton of my gloves. I leaned my entire body weight against the bar, driving my worn sneakers into the slick asphalt. At 32 years old, you stop hoping for the storm to pass. You just learn how to lower your head and walk through the water. "Keep your head down, Leo," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but I knew he could hear it over the wind. He was right beside me, his small hands pressed flat against the side of the metal cart, pushing with all the strength a 6-year-old could muster. I had wrapped him in an oversized, bright yellow vinyl raincoat. It swallowed him whole, but it kept his chest dry. "I'm pushing, Mom," Leo said, his small boot slipping slightly on the wet pavement. "We're almost to the avenue, I know, baby." "You're doing great." Inside the massive insulated vat mounted on the cart was 5 gallons of hot chicken soup. I had been awake since 3 a.m., standing in a drafty kitchen, chopping carrots and simmering broth. To the people walking past us, it was just street food. But to me, that golden liquid was the exact cost of our heating bill and the upcoming rent. It was the only barrier between us and the streets. We reached the intersection of 9th and Elm. The traffic was a gridlocked nightmare of red brake lights and impatient commuters. The pedestrian crosswalk sign flickered a fuzzy white through the rain, counting down from 15 seconds. "Push hard, Leo," I murmured, ignoring icy water seeping through my jacket. "Let's clear the street." We pushed the cart off the curb. The heavy rubber tires splashed into the flooded gutter. We made it halfway across the intersection. The digital timer ticked down mercilessly, 10, 8, 6, then the street fought back. Crunch. The front right wheel of the cart dropped violently into a deep, jagged pothole surrounding a sunken storm drain. The sudden halt was catastrophic. The entire 300-pound cart pitched forward. I slammed my hip against the iron handle, using my own body to absorb the kinetic shock and prevent the rig from tipping over. A sharp, white-hot pain shot up my lower spine. "Mom," Leo gasped, losing his footing. He splashed down onto his knees in the icy street. "I've got it. Stay back," I exhaled, my breath pluming in rapid white clouds. I yanked the handle backward, pulling with everything I had. The wheel didn't budge. It was wedged perfectly between the broken asphalt and the rusted iron grate. The pedestrian timer hit 0. Instantly, the traffic lights commanding the intersection snapped to green. The reaction from the line of waiting cars was immediate. A chaotic, aggressive wave of blaring horns erupted around us. To the drivers sitting inside their climate-controlled, leather-upholstered cabins, listening to jazz and adjusting their heaters, I wasn't a mother trying to survive. I was just an obstacle delaying their evening. "Move the damn cart," a muffled voice shouted from a rolled-down window. I didn't look at them. Panic is a luxury for people who have a safety net. I moved around to the front of the cart, stepping directly into the ankle-deep, freezing water pooling around the drain. My canvas shoes flooded instantly, my toes going completely numb. I gripped the lower metal frame of the cart, preparing to heave it upward. But a massive luxury black SUV at the front of the line decided it couldn't wait. The driver gunned the heavy engine, the tires squealing against the wet asphalt as the vehicle violently swerved to bypass us. The SUV's massive wheels plowed directly through a deep trench of accumulated street runoff. A heavy, thick wave of freezing, oily mud and street debris launched into the air. It crashed over me like a physical blow, soaking the front of my jacket and plastering my hair to my face. But worse than that, the wave washed directly over the top of the food cart. The impact knocked the heavy lid of the primary soup vat askew. I froze, standing in the middle of the roaring intersection, the filthy water dripping from my chin. I looked down at the vat. The dark, oily street sludge had seeped under the displaced lid, bleeding directly into the golden broth I had spent hours preparing. My mind ran the arithmetic of poverty in a fraction of a second. The cost of the chicken, the cost of the vegetables, the propane, the projected revenue. All of it entirely ruined in a single careless second by a driver who wouldn't even remember my face tomorrow. It was a financial wound that would take weeks to heal. I closed my eyes. I wanted to scream. I wanted to collapse onto the freezing asphalt, bang my fists against the wet concrete, and cry at the sheer, suffocating unfairness of it all. But I opened my eyes. I didn't shed a single tear. Crying doesn't fix a broken wheel, and it certainly wouldn't comfort the terrified 6-year-old boy kneeling in the rain behind me. "Stand up, Leo," I said, my voice completely stripped of despair, projecting an iron-clad serenity I didn't actually feel. Hold on to the back of my jacket. I knelt down in the freezing gutter. My cotton sleeves were heavy, clinging to my skin and restricting my movement. With rapid mechanical efficiency, I reached down and forcefully shoved the soaked fabric of my right sleeve high up past my elbow, exposing my bare forearm to the biting storm. I plunged my naked hand directly into the icy, murky water to grip the rusted lower axle. At that exact moment, a sedan idling directly behind us impatiently flashed its high-beam halogen headlights. The brilliant, blinding light cut through the gray curtain of the rain, sweeping across the flooded intersection. The beam struck my kneeling form, illuminating my bare right forearm with absolute surgical precision. There, exposed to the harsh light and the freezing wind, was the scar. It wasn't a subtle, faded mark. It was a massive, raised topography of violently damaged tissue that wrapped around my pale skin. The burn was severe, featuring an angry, deep red hue that contrasted sharply against the cold. The edges were jagged, but the overall shape was unmistakable. It looked exactly like a twisting, leaping flame. It was the permanent, brutal receipt of a choice I made 10 years ago on a burning highway. The freezing rainwater bit into the highly sensitive, damaged nerve endings of the scar tissue. It felt like someone holding a lit match directly to my skin. It was a phantom agony I lived with every winter, a sharp reminder of the night I pulled a stranger from a crushed car. I didn't gasp. I didn't coddle the injured flesh. I planted my frozen feet against the asphalt, tightened my grip on the submerged iron axle, and locked my jaw. Pain is just a signal, I reminded myself. Turn it off. I pulled. I channeled every ounce of my maternal desperation, every fragment of my quiet, bruised resilience into my shoulders. The veins in my neck strained. The red, flame-shaped scar on my arm stretched taut, appearing almost as if it were physically glowing under the intense glare of the headlights. With a harsh, scraping grind, the wheel broke free. I hoisted the front of the cart out of the pothole, slamming it safely onto the flat street. I didn't pause to catch my breath. I immediately grabbed the main handle, utilizing the momentum to shove the heavy rig across the remaining few yards of the intersection. The tires bumped onto the safety of the sidewalk just as the line of aggressive traffic surged forward behind us. I parked the cart against the brick wall of a closed storefront, shielding it from the worst of the wind. I leaned over the rusted handle, my chest heaving, my breathing ragged and shallow. The freezing mud dripped from my eyelashes, stinging my eyes. My bare right arm hung at my side, the red scar burning with a fierce, throbbing intensity against the winter air. I felt a small, timid tug on my jacket. I looked down. Leo was peering up at me from beneath his oversized yellow hood. His small face was pale, his eyes wide with worry. "Are you hurt, Mom?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly over the sound of the rain. "Your arm is red." I looked at my son. I looked at my ruined livelihood sitting in the metal vat. I felt the agonizing ache in my flesh and the freezing wetness seeping into my very bones. I reached out with my uninjured hand and gently wiped a stray, dirty raindrop from Leo's cheek. "No, my love," I said softly, forcing a gentle, unshakable warmth into my voice. "It's just the cold. We're perfectly fine." I rolled my wet sleeve back down, hiding the violent history written on my skin, and gripped the handle of the cart once more. Wealth, at a certain level, stops being about what you can buy. It becomes entirely about what you can block out. I was sitting in the back of my Maybach, completely insulated from the freezing, chaotic misery of the Manhattan winter storm. The acoustic glass windows reduced the howling wind and the blaring horns to a dull, distant murmur. The dual-zone climate control kept the cabin at a precise, comfortable 72 degrees. The air smelled of expensive leather, dry cleaned wool, and the dark roast Ethiopian coffee I was holding in a customized porcelain travel cup. I had paid a premium for this fortress. I paid for the silence. "I don't care about their fourth quarter projections, David," I said, keeping my voice low, flat, and entirely devoid of sympathy. I was on a call with my chief financial officer, staring blankly at the rain streaking the tinted glass. They leveraged their operational capital against a volatile market. They took the risk. Now the note is due. Foreclose the assets by Monday morning. I didn't wait for David's stammering reply. I tapped the screen of my phone and ended the call, tossing the device onto the empty seat beside me. It wasn't malice. It was just the cost of doing business. If you let people use their circumstances as an excuse, you become a charity, not a corporation. And I had learned a long time ago that the universe doesn't offer bailouts. I shifted my weight on the plush leather seat, suppressing a grimace. The drop in barometric pressure always brought the pain back. It started deep in my right femur, a dull, throbbing ache radiating outward from the 10 pounds of surgical steel rods and titanium screws holding my leg together. I reached down, my fingers brushing against the polished silver head of the mahogany cane resting against my knee. 10 years. It had been a decade since the crash on Highway 9, but on freezing, stormy nights like this, my body still remembered the heat. It remembered the suffocating smell of burning gasoline, the terrifying crunch of crushed metal, and the absolute certainty that I was going to burn alive in the driver's seat of my own car. I took a slow sip of my coffee, deliberately forcing the memory back into the vault where it belonged. "Traffic is a nightmare tonight, Mr. Sterling," my driver Thomas said from the front seat, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror, gridlocked at 9th and Elm. "Looks like someone's blocking the intersection." I looked out the windshield. Through the rhythmic, aggressive sweeping of the wipers, I saw the problem. Right in the middle of the flooded crosswalk, a rusted, dilapidated street food cart was stuck. I let out a slow, quiet breath of irritation. The city was full of these people. Unlicensed vendors, scrambling for nickels in a metropolitan machine that was designed to chew them up. It was a harsh reality, but it was reality. The light turned green. We didn't move. Thomas let out a sharp sigh of frustration and pressed the heel of his hand against the steering wheel. Honk. The sound was muffled inside the Maybach, but I knew how aggressive it sounded out there in the rain. "Just give them a second, Thomas," I murmured, staring out the side window. I wasn't being compassionate, I just disliked unnecessary noise. I watched the scene unfold through the rain-streaked glass, viewing it with the detached, analytical eye of a man accustomed to observing human liabilities. It was a woman. She looked young, maybe early 30s, but she possessed the hunched, battered posture of someone who had been carrying the weight of the world for far too long. She was wearing a cheap, faded cotton jacket that was completely useless against the storm. Beside her was a little kid in an oversized yellow raincoat, looking absolutely terrified. One of her wheels had dropped into a storm drain crater. She was stuck. I took another sip of my coffee, watching her struggle. "Call a tow. Leave the cart. Cut your losses," my mind calculated automatically. "You're risking your life and your kid's life for a few $100s of street food. It's a bad investment." Then the black SUV in the lane next to us lost its patience. The driver accelerated violently, swerving to bypass the stranded cart. I watched as the SUV's massive tires plowed through a deep pool of filthy street runoff. A heavy, oily wave of freezing mud and water arched through the air and crashed directly over the woman and her cart. The heavy lid of her soup vat was knocked sideways. The contaminated sludge poured right into whatever she was selling. I paused, the coffee cup hovering near my mouth. It was a brutal, completely unnecessary act of cruelty. I was a ruthless businessman, but I operated within the parameters of contracts and boardrooms. This was just raw, physical humiliation. I watched the woman closely. I knew human nature. I knew what happened when people were pushed past their breaking point. I expected her to drop to her knees. I expected her to start weeping, to throw her hands up, to scream at the taillights of the SUV, or to look around desperately for a savior. That is what people do when they want the world to fix their problems. She didn't do any of that. She stood perfectly still for a fraction of a second. Then she turned to the little boy, said something to him, and calmly knelt down into the freezing, flooded gutter. A flicker of genuine respect flared in my chest. She wasn't looking for a bailout. She was going to dig herself out of the mud. She reached down, grabbing the soaked, heavy fabric of her right sleeve. With a sharp, aggressive yank, she shoved the sleeve high up past her elbow, exposing her bare arm to the freezing storm, preparing to plunge her hand into the icy water to grip the rusted axle. At that exact millisecond, a sedan idling directly behind her flashed its high-beam headlights. The blinding halogen white light sliced cleanly through the gray curtain of the rain. It swept over the intersection, banishing the shadows, and struck her bare forearm with absolute, unforgiving clarity. Inside the Maybach's Sipstoft, I didn't consciously register dropping the cup. The customized porcelain slipped through my suddenly numb fingers. It hit the floorboard, shattering instantly. Scalding black coffee splashed across the expensive lambswool rug and splattered against the cuff of my bespoke trousers. I didn't feel the heat. I didn't hear the crash. My heart seized. A violent physical contraction that completely emptied my lungs of oxygen. "Mr. Sterling?" Thomas asked sharply, startled by the sudden noise. "Sir, are you all right?" I couldn't answer him. My vocal cords were paralyzed. My hands, trembling uncontrollably, reached out and gripped the polished silver head of my cane so hard my knuckles turned a bruised, bloodless white. My eyes were locked onto the woman's arm, separated from me by 10 yards of rain and a sheet of acoustic glass. There, illuminated brilliantly under the glare of the headlights, was a scar. It wasn't just a burn. It was a massive raised topography of violently damaged tissue, an angry deep red brand that wrapped around her pale skin. The edges were jagged, chaotic, but the overarching shape of the scar was unmistakable. It looked exactly like a leaping, twisting flame. The air inside the luxury cabin suddenly felt impossibly thin. The phantom smell of burning gasoline and melting plastic flooded my senses, so thick and real I practically choked on it. 10 years ago. I was trapped in the crushed, burning wreckage of my car on Highway 9. The flames were licking at the dashboard. My leg was shattered. The crowd of onlookers had backed away, too terrified of an imminent explosion to help. I was bleeding out, suffocating on the smoke, watching the fire crawl toward me, accepting that I was going to die a horrific, agonizing death. And then, a shadow had burst through the smoke. A young girl, no older than 22. She didn't have protective gear. She didn't have tools. She had a rusted iron crowbar she had found on the side of the road. She had shoved it into the warped frame of my door, using her own body weight as leverage. The heat radiating from the burning chassis was so intense it had literally superheated the iron bar. When the door finally buckled and snapped open, the red-hot iron bar had slipped. I remembered the exact sound it made. I remembered the sickening hiss of searing flesh as the glowing metal pressed directly into her bare right forearm. She hadn't screamed. She had simply bitten through her own lip, her eyes wide with adrenaline and agony, and she had reached into the burning cabin, grabbed me by the collar, and dragged my bleeding, heavy body out onto the cold asphalt just seconds before the gas tank ruptured. As I lay there gasping for air, staring up at the night sky, she had knelt beside me. She used a piece of her ruined shirt to bind her horrific burn. I had grabbed her wrist. I was a millionaire even then, used to controlling every situation. I demanded to know her name. I demanded to know who had just bought my life. She had looked down at me, her face smeared with ash and soot. "You're safe now," she had whispered, and then the sirens had wailed in the distance. She had looked toward the approaching lights, stood up, and vanished into the chaotic milling crowd of onlookers. For 10 years I had searched. I had hired private investigators, I had pulled traffic cam footage, hospital admission records, and police reports. I had offered massive anonymous rewards. But she had simply evaporated. The only evidence I had that she was real was my own heartbeat and the burned-in memory of the horrific flame-shaped scar the iron bar had branded into her arm. I stared through the window of the Maybach. Outside, the woman in the faded cotton jacket planted her feet. The red scar on her arm stretched tight, appearing almost to glow under the headlights. With a brutal heave, she ripped the heavy food cart out of the pothole. She shoved it onto the safety of the sidewalk. She didn't look toward the line of cars. She didn't look at my Maybach. She simply reached out, wiped a raindrop off her little boy's face, rolled her wet sleeve back down to hide the burn, and gripped the rusted handle of her cart. "Sir?" Thomas asked again, his voice tight with concern, looking at the spilled coffee. "Should I pull over?" I couldn't tear my eyes away from the woman standing in the rain. The ghost of Highway 9. The phantom savior who had haunted my boardroom decisions, my sleepless nights, and my very existence for a decade. She wasn't a myth. She was a single mother, pushing a broken soup cart through the freezing mud of Manhattan, enduring the absolute worst the city had to throw at her. And I had just watched my driver honk at her. "Thomas," I whispered. My voice didn't sound like the ruthless commanding CEO of Sterling Equities. It sounded like a man who had just been struck by lightning. "Yes, Mr. Sterling?" I swallowed hard, unlocking my white-knuckled grip from the cane. I reached for the heavy chrome handle of the car door. Put the car in park. The heavy chrome door handle of the Maybach was cold beneath my fingertips. "Put the car in park," I told Thomas. "Sir?" I didn't answer him. I couldn't. For a suspended eternal moment, the world outside the acoustic glass of the luxury sedan simply ceased to exist. The frantic, blaring horns of the gridlocked Manhattan traffic faded into absolute silence. The freezing rain battering the windshield began to morph, twisting into a different sound entirely. A violent, hungry crackling. The scent of spilled Ethiopian coffee soaking into the lamb's wool floorboards was suddenly overpowered by the suffocating, toxic stench of burning rubber, ruptured fuel lines, and scorched metal. The vault in my mind had burst wide open. 10 years ago, it was a Tuesday night in November. I was 35 years old, operating under the dangerous, intoxicating illusion of corporate invincibility. I was driving a silver Porsche 911 Carrera down Highway 9 at 85 miles an hour, navigating the winding coastal roads with the arrogant ease of a man who believed he controlled every variable in his life. But wealth cannot bribe the laws of physics. It cannot negotiate with a blown tire on a heavy-duty commercial truck drifting blindly into the fast lane. The impact wasn't a sound. It was an apocalyptic erasure of reality. I remember the violent, sickening spin, the terrifying weightlessness as the Porsche left the asphalt, tumbling down the embankment. The world inverted, shattering into a kaleidoscope of breaking safety glass and crushing steel. When the kinetic nightmare finally ground to a halt, I was hanging upside down, suspended only by my seatbelt in the mangled, compressed cavern of the driver's seat. Everything was wet. The warm, sticky fluid running into my eyes was my own blood. The sharp, agonizing pressure pinning my right leg was the engine block, which had collapsed backward, crushing my femur into splintered fragments. Then came the light. It started as a flickering, malevolent orange glow beneath the crumpled hood. Within seconds it escalated into a roaring inferno, feeding greedily on the high-octane fuel spilling across the dry brush of the embankment. I was entirely conscious. The adrenaline in my system was a cruel curse, keeping me awake to witness my own execution. Through the spiderweb cracks of the shattered windshield, I could see the highway above. Cars had stopped. People had pulled over and gathered on the shoulder of the road. I saw their faces illuminated by the towering flames of my own funeral pyre. But nobody moved forward. They stood there, 20 yards away. I saw the glowing, rectangular screens of smartphones held up in the darkness. They were recording. They were watching a man burn to death, paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming heat and the absolute certainty that the car was a bomb waiting to detonate. It was the ultimate, horrific realization of my life's work. I had spent decades building an empire, accumulating billions, and isolating myself at the top of the world. And in the end, I was nothing more than content for a bystander's tragedy. I was going to die completely alone, in public. I closed my eyes. The smoke seared my throat. I stopped fighting the crushed metal pinning my legs. I prepared for the fire to breach the firewall. And then a shadow eclipsed the flames. Someone broke the perimeter. It wasn't a firefighter in a turnout coat. It wasn't a police officer. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 22 years old, wearing a faded college sweatshirt and jeans. She didn't approach cautiously. She didn't hesitate. She sprinted headlong into the inferno, throwing herself down the embankment into a heat so intense it was already melting the plastic trim of the car's exterior. In her hands, she gripped a heavy rusted iron crowbar, likely scavenged from the highway debris or pulled from the trunk of a bystander's car. She dropped to her knees beside the crushed, warped frame of the driver's side door. The heat was astronomical. I could smell the nylon of her shoes beginning to scorch. I couldn't hear her over the deafening roar of the fire, but I could see her face perfectly. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the terrifying orange blaze, but her jaw was locked in an expression of absolute irrational defiance. "Get out of here!" I tried to scream, but the blood filling my throat reduced the warning to a pathetic wet choke. "It's going to blow." She ignored me. She wedged the flat, wedge-shaped end of the iron crowbar deep into the buckled seam of the door frame. She threw her entire body weight against the iron. The metal groaned, screeching in protest, but the door refused to yield. The flames licked around the front quarter panel, whipping in the wind, wrapping dangerously close to her arms. The iron crowbar, jammed directly against the burning chassis, was rapidly conducting the immense heat. I watched in horror as the middle of the metal bar in her hands began to glow with a dull, terrifying orange hue. She didn't let go. She let out a scream not of pain, but of pure adrenaline-fueled desperate exertion. She slammed her weight down on the superheated bar one last time. Crack. The door latch shattered. The warped metal buckled outward. But as the heavy door violently gave way, the sudden lack of resistance caused the superheated iron crowbar to slip from the crevice. The glowing, jagged iron slammed directly into the exposed skin of her bare right forearm. The sound cut through the roar of the fire. It was a sickening, hissing sizzle of searing flesh. I watched the red-hot metal brand her skin, carving a deep, chaotic trench of ruined tissue. It flared upward, taking the horrific, unmistakable shape of a twisting flame. The pain must have been blinding, astronomical. It was a third-degree burn inflicted in a fraction of a second. Any normal human being would have dropped the bar, collapsed in shock, or retreated to the safety of the highway. She didn't retreat. She bit down on her lower lip so hard a line of blood trickled down her chin. She dropped the crowbar, reached directly into the smoking cabin, with her burned, trembling arm, and grabbed the heavy collar of my bespoke suit jacket. I was dead weight, a 200-pound man anchored by a crushed leg. She shouldn't have been able to move me, but human desperation defies physics. She dragged me. The agony in my shattered femur was an absolute whiteout of pain, but I felt the cold, hard ground scrapings against my back. She hauled me out of the wreckage, her boots scrambling for purchase in the dirt, dragging me 10, 15, 20 feet backward up the embankment. Boom. The gas tank finally ruptured. The explosion was a concussive shockwave that physically lifted us both off the ground. A massive, blinding fireball erupted into the night sky, raining molten metal, burning rubber, and shattered glass down onto the highway. The heat washed over us like a physical tsunami. If she had been 5 seconds slower, we would both have been incinerated. I lay on my back on the cold asphalt of the highway shoulder, staring up at the raining embers, coughing violently as oxygen finally hit my smoke-filled lungs. She collapsed onto her knees beside me. She was panting wildly, her chest heaving. I looked at her right arm. The burn was catastrophic. It was a massive, raw, bleeding trench of blistered flesh that mirrored the very flames we had just narrowly escaped. She didn't cry. With trembling, soot-stained fingers, she ripped the bottom hem of her sweatshirt. Using her teeth and her uninjured hand, she tightly bound the horrific wound, tying off the makeshift tourniquet to stem the bleeding. I reached out, my hand shaking uncontrollably and slick with my own blood clamped weakly onto her left wrist. I was a man who owned skyscrapers. I bought companies and liquidated them before breakfast. But in that moment, lying in the dirt, I owned absolutely nothing but the breath in my lungs, and every single molecule of it belonged entirely to her. Who? I choked out, my voice a ragged, broken rasp. Who are you? She looked down at me. Her face was smeared with black grease, ash, and sweat. Her eyes were dark, fathomless pools of pure survival. She didn't look at my expensive watch. She didn't look at my tailored suit. She just looked at a man who was no longer burning. "You're safe now," she whispered. The wail of approaching sirens suddenly pierced the night air. The flashing red and blue lights of the first responder vehicles crested the horizon, painting the smoke in chaotic, strobing colors. I blinked, the blood stinging my eyes. When I opened them a second later, she was standing up. She looked at the approaching ambulances. Then, she looked back at the crowd of onlookers who, emboldened by the arrival of the police, were finally beginning to inch forward. She didn't wait for the paramedics to praise her. She didn't wait for the police to take her statement. She didn't wait for me to offer her a reward. She took a step backward, blending into the shadows and the panicked, shifting crowd. And she vanished. For 10 years, I had hunted a ghost. I had spent millions on private investigators, scoured hospital burn unit admission records across 3 states, and deployed facial recognition software on the bystander videos uploaded to the internet. But the videos only showed a blurry silhouette, and the hospitals reported no admissions matching her description that night. She had simply absorbed the catastrophic injury and walked away into the dark. Gasp. The memory violently released its suffocating grip, ejecting me back into the present. I sucked in a sharp, ragged breath of the cool, climate-controlled air of the Maybach. The phantom smell of burning rubber evaporated, replaced by the sharp aroma of the spilled coffee soaking into my carpet. Outside the acoustic glass, the freezing Manhattan rain continued its relentless assault on the city. My hand was still gripping the heavy chrome door handle. I turned my head and looked out the window. 10 yards away, standing on the sidewalk under the meager shelter of a closed storefront's awning, was the ghost of Highway 9. She was older now. The world had clearly battered her. She was wearing a cheap, soaked cotton jacket, shivering in the freezing wind. But the iron resilience in her posture, the quiet, unbreakable, terrifying defiance that had compelled her to drag a dying man out of a burning car, was exactly the same. I had spent a decade trying to find a way to repay a debt that could not possibly be quantified in dollars. I had expected to find a woman who would ask for the world. I had expected someone who would leverage her heroism for a blank check. Instead, I found a single mother who refused to let a broken, rusted soup cart defeat her. A woman who would plunge her scarred, traumatized flesh into freezing mud just to keep her child fed. "Mr. Sterling," Thomas urged from the front seat, his voice laced with confusion and alarm. He reached back, attempting to stop me. "Sir, please, it's a deluge out there. The temperature is dropping. Let me at least get the umbrella." "Do not move, Thomas," I commanded. My voice was no longer the flat, detached tone of a billionaire CEO liquidating assets. It carried a heavy, tectonic weight. I didn't need an umbrella. I didn't need to be insulated from the cold. For the first time in 10 years, I needed to feel the rain. I gripped the handle, pulled it back, and kicked the heavy door of the Maybach open into the storm. The heavy door of the Maybach swung open, and the sanctuary of my billionaire existence was instantly annihilated. The storm did not care about my net worth. The freezing Manhattan wind hit me like a physical blow, driving the icy rain directly into my face. Within 3 seconds, my bespoke charcoal suit, tailored from imported Italian wool, was completely saturated, clinging to my shoulders like a wet shroud. "Mr. Sterling, sir, wait!" Thomas shouted from the driver's seat, his voice laced with absolute panic. I heard the rustle of an umbrella opening behind me. "Stay in the car, Thomas," I ordered, my voice cutting through the wind with a harsh, immovable authority. I stepped out onto the flooded asphalt. I didn't reach back for my mahogany cane. The moment my right foot took my full weight, a sharp, white-hot spike of agony shot up my shattered femur, radiating through the titanium rods holding my leg together. I gritted my teeth, a low hiss escaping my lips. For 10 years I had walked with a calculated, dignified limp, always relying on the cane to absorb the trauma of Highway 9. But tonight the pain felt necessary. It felt like a tether. I closed the heavy car door behind me, sealing Thomas and the warmth of my empire away. I began to walk. The intersection of 9th and Elm was a chaotic blur of blaring horns and blinding headlights. I walked with a severe, agonizing limp, dragging my right leg slightly as I waded through the ankle-deep, freezing street runoff. Drivers honked at me. A taxi swerved, splashing a wave of filthy water against my trousers. I didn't flinch. I didn't look at them. My eyes were entirely locked onto the small, dark silhouette of the woman standing on the sidewalk 10 yards away. She was trying to stabilize the heavy food cart. The violent drop into the pothole had bent the front axle, and the rig was leaning dangerously toward the brick wall. She had her shoulder pressed against the rusted metal, her wet canvas shoes slipping on the concrete as she tried to force the heavy frame back into alignment. Her little boy was standing behind her, terrified, his small hands clutching the back of her soaked jacket. She was struggling. She was completely exhausted, but she wasn't giving up. I reached the curb. The physical exertion of walking without my cane in the freezing cold had left me breathless. My chest heaved, my silver hair plastered to my forehead by the rain. I didn't introduce myself. I didn't say excuse me. I simply stepped forward, reaching out with both hands, and grabbed the front iron bar of the cart. My hands were the hands of a CEO. They were manicured, soft, accustomed to holding platinum fountain pens and crystal Scotch glasses. The moment my fingers wrapped around the rusted, freezing iron, a thick layer of black street grease and icy mud smeared across my palms. The filthy sludge soaked instantly into the pristine white cuffs of my tailored shirt. The iron scraped harshly against the bezel of my Patek Philippe watch. I didn't care. I planted my boots, locked my jaw against the agonizing pain in my leg, and pulled upward with all the strength I had left. With a harsh, grinding screech, the bent axle shifted. Together, we leveled the 300-pound cart, stabilizing it securely against the concrete footing of the building. "Hey," she snapped, her voice sharp and defensive. She immediately recoiled, pulling the cart back an inch and stepping squarely between me and her son. It was the instinctual, fierce movement of a mother protecting her child from a wealthy, unpredictable stranger, stepping out of the dark. I let go of the cart, taking a half step back, my hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender. Up close, the reality of her struck me with devastating force. She was shivering violently, her lips possessing a faint, dangerous tint of blue from the cold. The cheap cotton jacket she wore was drenched, offering zero protection. Yet her dark eyes were completely unyielding. They were the eyes of a woman who had fought a war every single day of her life and had absolutely no intention of surrendering. "I didn't ask for your help," Elena said coldly, her gaze sweeping over my ruined suit, my expensive watch, and the mud covering my hands. She didn't look impressed by my wealth. She looked highly suspicious of it. "We're fine. Have a good evening, sir." She turned away, reaching down to make sure her son's yellow hood was securely over his head. "Highway 9, I said. The words barely made it past the knot in my throat. They were a ragged, trembling whisper, instantly swallowed by the roaring wind. But she heard them. Elena's hand froze on the collar of her son's raincoat. She didn't turn around immediately. I saw the rigid tension lock her shoulders into place. The rain battered the rusted metal of the cart between us. 10 years ago, I continued, my voice breaking completely, The authoritative billionaire entirely vanishing, leaving only the terrified man who had been burning alive. A silver Porsche, it was upside down, it was on fire. Elena slowly stood up, she turned around to face me. The defensive anger in her eyes had evaporated, replaced by a profound calculating shock. She looked at my face, really looked at it. She traced the lines of my jaw, the gray at my temples and the deep surgical scars barely visible on my neck. She was looking past the tailored suit, past the Maybach idling in the street behind me, connecting the features of the titan of industry to the bloody, dying man she had dragged from an inferno. Her gaze flicked downward, noting the severe way I was heavily favoring my right leg. The recognition settled into her eyes with absolute undeniable clarity. "You," she breathed, the word almost lost to the storm. "You left," I said, the tears finally mixing with the freezing rain on my face. I took a desperate, limping step toward her. I didn't care that her son was watching. I didn't care that I was standing in a gutter. "You pulled me out of the fire. You wrapped your shirt around my arm. And then you just walked away. Before I could even ask your name." I stared at her right arm, currently covered by the wet, faded cotton sleeve. I knew the horrific, flame-shaped brand was resting right beneath the fabric. "You bought my life," I wept quietly, the absolute magnitude of the moment crushing my lungs. "I've looked for you every single day for 10 years. I thought you were a ghost. A normal person would have broken down. A normal person, crushed by poverty, standing in the freezing rain with a ruined cart of soup, would have realized they had just won the lottery. They would have wept with relief. They would have cried out about how hard their life had been, how much pain the burn had caused them, and demanded the universe finally balance the scales. Elena did absolutely none of that. She looked at me. Her expression was a fortress of absolute impenetrable steel. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. The quiet resilience that had allowed her to plunge her arm into superheated iron 10 years ago was exactly what left her spine perfectly straight now. "I'm glad you survived, sir," Elena said. Her voice was remarkably steady, possessing a quiet, devastating dignity. "You look well." That was it. "I'm glad you survived." She turned back to the cart, wiping the rain from the rusted handle. She was dismissing me. She was treating the salvation of my life as a completed transaction that required no further discussion. Panic seized my chest. The corporate instinct, the ingrained, deeply conditioned reflex of a billionaire facing a problem, violently took over. When a situation is broken, you buy the solution. When a debt is owed, you clear the ledger. It was the only language I knew how to speak. "Wait. Please, wait," I stammered, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I reached frantically inside the breast pocket of my ruined suit jacket. I pulled out my slim, leather-bound checkbook and a platinum fountain pen. The freezing rain immediately hit the pristine, watermarked paper, blurring the ink of the routing numbers. "Your cart is broken," I said rapidly, my words tumbling over each other in desperate panic sequence. "Your merchandise is ruined. I saw what that car did. You're freezing. You have a child. I can fix this. I can fix all of it right now." I clicked the pen open. I didn't even know her name, but I was fully prepared to write cash and follow it with a number containing so many zeros it would fundamentally alter her existence forever. "Tell me what you need," I pleaded, my thumb smudging the wet paper as I prepared to write. "$1 million? $5 million? I own sterling equities. I can buy you a house tonight. I can set up a trust for the boy. Just let me pay the debt. Let me give you." "Stop." The word was not shouted. It was spoken with a low, absolute finality that hit me harder than a physical blow. Before the platinum nib of my pen could even touch the wet paper, Elena stepped forward. She reached out with her right hand, the hand connected to the arm that bore my horrific, fiery brand. Her skin was freezing cold, rough, and deeply calloused from years of relentless manual labor. She placed her fingers directly over the back of my soft, manicured, trembling hand. She pushed the pen down, away from the checkbook. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I looked up from the paper, my eyes locking onto hers. There was no greed in her dark eyes. There was no desperate relief. There was only a profound, fierce, and unyielding pride. It was a pride that money could not replicate, purchase, or comprehend. "Put your money away, Mr. Sterling," Elena said softly, the rain washing over her face. I don't understand," I whispered, genuinely paralyzed by the rejection. "You saved my life. You have a terrible scar. You're out here in the freezing rain. Please, you have to let me compensate you." Elena slowly let go of my hand. She took a step back, her posture radiating an untouchable, majestic grace despite her soaked, impoverished clothes. "Compensation is for your service rendered," Elena replied. her voice cutting through the roar of the storm with perfect crystalline clarity. "It is an exchange of goods." She looked down at her son, placing a protective hand on his yellow hood, then looked back into my eyes. "When I ran down that embankment 10 years ago, I didn't see a billionaire," she said, her tone completely devoid of arrogance, speaking only the raw, absolute truth. "I saw a human being burning in a cage. I didn't break that door open to open an investment account. I broke it open because it was the right thing to do." She pointed a freezing finger at the leather checkbook in my hand. "If I take your money right now," she continued, her voice hardening into pure, uncompromising steel, "then what I did wasn't an act of grace. It was a transaction, and I do not sell my kindness, sir. I saved a human life." The words shattered the very foundation of my reality. For 45 years, I had operated under the absolute conviction that everything in the world had a price tag. Every loyalty could be bought. Every sin could be settled. Every person had a number. But standing in front of me was a woman with absolutely nothing, rejecting a fortune because it would cheapen the purity of her sacrifice. She possessed a moral wealth so vast, so incredibly profound, that my billions suddenly felt entirely worthless. I was the poorest man in the intersection. I slowly lowered the checkbook. The platinum pen slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the wet concrete. I didn't pick it up. "But how do I thank you?" I asked, my voice reduced to a broken, empty whisper. "How do I live with the debt?" Elena looked at me for a long, quiet moment. The harshness in her eyes softened, replaced by a gentle, weary wisdom. "You live a life that was worth saving," she answered simply. She turned away from me. She gripped the rusted iron handle of her food cart. She didn't look back at the Maybach, or the checkbook, or the weeping billionaire standing in the gutter. "Come on, Leo," she said softly to her son. "Push hard, baby. We're going home." The rusty wheels of the cart let out a sharp squeak. I stood completely frozen in the freezing rain, the pain radiating through my shattered leg, watching the woman in the faded cotton jacket push her heavy burden down the dark, storm-swept avenue. I didn't follow her. I couldn't. She had just established a boundary that my money could not cross. She had rejected my pity, refused my charity, and completely dismantled my worldview in less than 3 minutes. The heavy door of the Maybach opened behind me. Thomas rushed out with a large black umbrella, holding it over my head, shielding me from the storm. "Mr. Sterling," Thomas said gently, looking at the mud on my hands and the tears on my face. "Sir, please." "You're freezing. Let's get you inside." I looked down at my hands. The black grease from her cart was stained deeply into my skin, smeared across my wedding band and my Patek Philippe. It was the dirt of a woman who fought for every single breath she took. I slowly turned around and let Thomas guide me back into the warm, silent sanctuary of the Maybach. As the heavy door clicked shut, cutting off the noise of the storm, I looked down at the blank check still clutched in my hand. The rain had washed away the ink of my signature line. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the leather headrest. Elena was right. You cannot buy grace with a checkbook. If I wanted to honor the ghost of Highway 9, I couldn't do it by throwing money at her feet like a wealthy savior. I had to stop acting like a billionaire looking for absolution, and start acting like a man worthy of her sacrifice. I opened my eyes, the tears gone, replaced by a sharp absolute and laser-focused clarity. "Thomas," I said, my voice steady, resonant, and completely transformed. "Yes, Mr. Sterling." "Call David," I ordered, staring at the blurred red taillights in the distance. "Tell him to cancel the foreclosure on that firm we discussed earlier. And then, I need you to contact our private acquisitions team." Thomas glanced at me in the rearview mirror, confused. "Acquisitions, sir? At this hour? What are we looking to buy?" I looked down at the street grease staining my cuffs. I was no longer looking to pay off a debt. I was looking to make the greatest investment of my entire life. "A restaurant," I said quietly. It took my private acquisitions team exactly 48 hours to secure the commercial real estate. It took my legal department another 24 to draft the corporate structuring. When you possess billions of dollars, the world bends to your timeline. But as I stood on the cracked linoleum of a 4th-floor hallway in a dilapidated Brooklyn walk-up, I wasn't thinking about my wealth. I was thinking about my absolute lack of it. I leaned heavily against my mahogany cane, catching my breath. The elevator in the building had been broken for months, according to the handwritten out-of-order sign taped to the lobby doors. Climbing 4 flights of stairs had sent a blinding, white-hot agony radiating through the titanium hardware in my right femur. But I had explicitly forbidden Thomas from helping me up the stairs, and I had refused to take my prescribed painkillers that morning. I needed to feel the climb. I needed to walk into her world completely grounded in reality, stripped of my insulations. I adjusted the thick leather portfolio under my left arm, squared my shoulders, and knocked firmly on door 4B. I heard the muffled sound of footsteps, the sliding of a heavy deadbolt, and the rattle of a brass security chain. The door opened just a few inches. Elena peered through the narrow gap. She was wearing a faded gray sweatshirt, her dark hair tied back in a messy knot. There were dark circles of profound exhaustion under her eyes. When she saw me standing in the dim fluorescent light of the hallway, her expression instantly hardened into the same impenetrable fortress of steel I had seen in the freezing rain 3 nights ago. "I told you, Mr. Sterling," Elena said, her voice low, rigid, and strictly defensive. "We have nothing to discuss. I don't want your money." She began to close the door. "I didn't bring my checkbook," I said quietly, keeping my hands entirely visible and making no move to block the door. "And I didn't come here to offer you charity. I came here to talk about business." The door stopped moving. Elena frowned, her dark eyes narrowing with deep suspicion. "Business? May I have 5 minutes of your time, ma'am?" I asked, my tone radiating the absolute unwavering respect I usually reserved for equal partners in a corporate boardroom. "If you ask me to leave after that, I will walk down these stairs and you will never see me again." "You have my word." She studied my face for a long, quiet moment. She looked at the heavy cane, noting the subtle tremor in my leg from the agonizing climb. Slowly, she unhooked the security chain and opened the door, stepping aside to let me in. The apartment was incredibly small. The paint on the walls was chipping, and the radiator in the corner hissed with a weak, inconsistent rhythm. But despite the suffocating poverty of the space, it was impeccably clean. A small, battered wooden table sat in the center of the kitchenette, covered in meticulously organized stacks of past-due bills, a calculator, and a notebook filled with frantic, handwritten arithmetic. Leo was sitting on a worn rug in the corner, building a structure out of faded plastic blocks. He looked up, his wide eyes recognizing me from the intersection. I offered him a small, warm smile before turning my attention entirely back to his mother. Elena stood by the counter, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. The right sleeve of her sweatshirt was pulled down tight, hiding the catastrophic, flame-shaped scar that had branded her flesh to save my life. 5 minutes, Mr. Sterling," she said, her spine perfectly straight. I nodded. I didn't sit down. I didn't want to presume any comfort in her sanctuary. 3 days ago, you told me that compensation is an exchange of goods," I began, my voice steady, resonant, and entirely devoid of billionaire arrogance. "You told me that if you took my money, it would turn an act of grace into a transaction. You were right. You taught me a lesson that 45 years of wealth completely failed to." Elena's defensive posture didn't break, but her eyes softened by a fraction of a millimeter. She was listening. "So, I didn't come here to settle a debt. A life cannot be bought and it cannot be repaid," I continued, stepping forward to place the heavy leather portfolio onto her small wooden kitchen table. "However, I am a venture capitalist, Elena. My entire existence is built on identifying high-value assets and investing in people who possess the fortitude to weather impossible storms." I opened the portfolio. Inside was a stack of crisp, legally binding documents printed on heavy stock paper. "After we parted Wabaz, I had my team some research," I said, tapping the top page. "I wanted to know what was inside that food cart you were risking your life to protect. I learned that your chicken soup is practically a lifeline for the third-shift construction workers in the garment district. I learned that you wake up at 3 in the morning, every single day, to prepare it from scratch." Elena looked down at the documents, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What is this?" "This is a commercial partnership agreement," I said, my voice dropping into a register of pure, undeniable conviction. I looked her directly in the eyes. I wanted her to see that I wasn't a man driven by guilt anymore. I was a man driven by absolute awe. "I have officially purchased the deed to a prime, 2-story commercial corner lot in Midtown Manhattan. It has a fully equipped, state-of-the-art industrial kitchen and a seating capacity for 100 patrons, I explained, tracking her stunned expression. "I am the financial backer. But a restaurant is nothing without a soul, and I have never met a human being with a stronger soul than yours." Elena's breath caught in her throat. Her arms slowly uncrossed, falling to her sides. "I am officially offering you the position of executive chef and co-founder of this establishment," I stated, tapping the signature line on the contract. "We split the equity 50-50. You have absolute creative control over the menu, the hiring, and the operations. I handle the overhead and the supply chain." "Mr. Sterling," Elena whispered, her voice trembling as the sheer tectonic magnitude of the offer began to crack her ironclad composure. I don't have a culinary degree. I run a rusted cart out of a storm drain. You can't be serious." "I have never been more serious in my life," I replied instantly. "I don't invest in degrees, Elena, I invest in resilience. I watched you plunge your arm into freezing mud to save your livelihood. A woman who fights that hard for a broken soup cart will build an empire if she's given a proper kitchen." I reached into the portfolio and pulled out a second, smaller document. "There is one final clause," I said gently, glancing over at Leo, who was happily attaching a blue block to his plastic tower. "As a standard corporate benefit for executive partners at Sterling Equities, the company provides a fully funded, irrevocable educational trust for your dependents. Leo's college tuition, health insurance, and future are completely secured." I placed the second document next to the first. "This is not charity, Elena," I concluded, my voice thick with profound respect. "This is a business proposition. I am providing the capital. You are providing the talent, the menu, and the relentless grit that kept you alive. You earn every single penny of this." For 10 years I had searched for the girl who had vanished into the smoke. I had expected a dramatic, tearful reunion, but the reality was infinitely more beautiful. Elena looked down at the contracts, the impenetrable armor she had worn to survive the brutal streets of New York finally, completely shattered. She didn't fall to her knees. She didn't weep with the subservient gratitude of someone receiving a handout. She closed her eyes and a single, quiet tear of absolute transcendent triumph slipped down her cheek. It was the tear of a mother who finally realized she would never have to push a broken cart through the freezing rain ever again. She opened her eyes, reached out with her right hand, and picked up the pen I had laid on the table. She didn't hesitate. She signed her name on the bottom line. When she finished, she set the pen down and looked up at me. She extended her right hand, the hand connected to the arm that bore my fiery brand. I reached out and shook it. Her grip was calloused, incredibly strong, and completely equal to mine. "When do we open, partner?" she asked, a brilliant, radiant smile finally breaking across her face. 6 months later, the brutal, freezing winter had surrendered to a warm, golden Manhattan summer. The restaurant, which Elena had aptly named the Ember, was operating at full capacity. The air was filled with the rich, intoxicating aroma of roasted garlic, simmering broth, and the lively hum of satisfied patrons. The reviews had been spectacular, but I didn't care about the critics. I only cared about the woman commanding the kitchen. I sat at a quiet corner booth, my cane resting against the leather seat. Leo sat across from me, intensely focused on finishing a massive bowl of pasta, occasionally pausing to tell me about a science project he was working on at his new school. I looked past him, my gaze resting on the open-concept industrial kitchen. Elena was standing at the stainless steel pass, orchestrating the chaotic symphony of line cooks and waiters with the absolute, unyielding authority of a general. She was laughing, tasting a sauce, and calling out orders. She was wearing a pristine, tailored white chef's coat. The sleeves were rolled high above her elbows to beat the heat of the commercial stoves. Under the bright, warm halogen lights of the kitchen, the massive red, flame-shaped scar on her right forearm was completely exposed to the world. She didn't hide it anymore. She didn't pull her sleeves down when patrons looked at it. She wore it exactly for what it was, a magnificent, terrifying badge of honor. It was the physical proof that she had walked into an inferno and emerged victorious. Elena caught my eye from across the dining room. She didn't give me a subservient nod or a look of indebted gratitude. She simply raised a tasting spoon in the air, flashing me a fiercely confident, triumphant smile before turning back to the fire of her stoves. I leaned back in the booth, picking up my glass of wine. I had spent my entire life accumulating wealth, believing that money was the ultimate shield against the world. But looking at Elena, I realized the absolute truth. The greatest return on investment I had ever received wasn't measured in profit margins or stock evaluations. It was the privilege of watching a hero finally step out of the freezing rain, walk directly into the light, and claim the kingdom she had always deserved.